Back in 2019, it seemed something of a rarity to see Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell out in the Square Mile talking up the growth of the city and its benefits. But times have changed, it seems. Just last week, under Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's leadership, the Labour Party launched a major charm offensive on business and the city that laid out its plans for the sector ahead of an election. I'm Charlie Conchi, Chief City Reporter at City A.M, with another episode of Bonds Ballots, where we'll be digging into the detail of some of those plans and how Labour is looking to woo the city ahead of an election. Joining us in just a moment to do that will be Ian Anderson, a man who has raised some eyebrows in the past year for ditching his Tory membership and working with the Labour Party. He's just drafted a report looking at how a Labour government could forge a relationship with business. So let's go and hear what he has to say. Ian, thank you so much for joining us at City A.M studios for Bonds and Ballots. Great to have you in. I imagine it's been a very busy start to the year with the report launch. This series is all about how Westminster and the city interact. As I mentioned there, you've just written the book on this effectively for the Labour Party. But I want to just get into some of your own personal sort of business and political journey over the past few decades, because I think it is quite an instructive one. You're obviously a member of the Tory party for several decades. You were an advisor to Boris Johnson's government. And you made some headlines, raised some eyebrows last year for the sort of switch of allegiance, a few barbs thrown at the Conservative Party. I just wondered if you could take us through why you made that move and why then.
So, look, thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here. Look, I mean, I've been a member of the Conservative Party for 40 years, but I think it's just a real confluence of events, Johnny, that kind of came together, which made me say, up with this, I cannot put anymore. I mean, I think the most fundamental for me, and no doubt for many viewers of this, was the budget of 2022, when the Conservative Party literally threw away its long-held approach, which is stability in terms of the fiscal situation and stability in terms of British institutions. That was literally almost tossed aside in a few days. And I found myself really kind of scratching my head, like lots of people, to say, well, hang on, wait a minute. Sound money, sound fundamentals are so important for any economy, perhaps even more importantly for the UK economy after the political ups and downs that we've had over the last few years. So it was firstly that, but also anybody that knows me knows that I have been for most of my life a one nation conservative, about bringing communities together, not pitching communities apart from each other. And yeah, look, I was briefly the LGBT business champion the first time the UK had ever appointed that role in Boris Johnson's administration. I walked away from that role because I didn't think the government was actually serious about equality. I think I've sadly been proved to be right about that, because all the promises that they made in terms of legislation have just not happened. And then I think the final thing really is, in my day job chairing Cicero, I work with a lot of international investors, and they've been sitting scratching their heads as well. So, I just got to the point, frankly, after 40 years, maybe I should have done it earlier, where I couldn't do it anymore. And I think the country needs change, and I think Keir Starmer is the change.
Let's come on to then how Labour is making its case to business and the interaction between the two, whether it now can be a credible party of business. And I think you touched on some of the sort of mechanisms of how that might work between Westminster Labour Party if they do get elected to government. You say currently it's unfocused and uncoordinated. There is a lack of specific departmental engagement. I mean, what is the actual remedy for that? So that feels like a criticism of Whitehall itself, inherent in Whitehall, and you'd almost require a sort of Dominic Cummings style overhaul to actually get to grips with it. Is that a realistic aim to sort of tackle those issues?
Well, the Dominic Cummings recipe was to smash things up. And I I've never believed that's the right approach in life. I think I think persuasion, I think getting people to come with you rather than, pointing guns at people's head is a much better approach. But you're right. Look, I've produced this report for Labour. I deliberately called it partnership. I've spoken to 350 businesses in the last 4 months, small businesses, large businesses, domestic businesses, inward investors to our country. And they are all basically saying the same thing. They don't know what the point of entry is to government anymore. They are absolutely tired of the chopping and changing in terms of the people. And yes, they want to see better capabilities in government to be able to have a genuine dialogue. Now, what
capabilities, is that people themselves, people with the actual know-how, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the groups that I talked to when I was preparing my thinking was the Institute for Government. And I thought a lot about, am I going to be pointing the finger at Whitehall here and saying that Whitehall can't do a good job? I think Whitehall, and any time I've worked with senior officials in Whitehall can do an excellent job. But I think there needs to be an investment in civil service capability. I know myself as a private sector person, when you are presenting, when you're pitching for business, you want to be asked some really hard questions, right? When you're being asked really hard questions that the person buying the services is properly tooled up to understand, but also I think in this particular case, that the taxpayer money is going to be used wisely and effectively. So I think part of what I've said to Labour, and I put in my report, and frankly any future government could use, I hope, my recommendations, is that we need to have an investment in civil service capability. We need to have business and business relations treated very, very seriously at the top of government. None of this business approach anymore. And the final thing that, it sounds a very old-fashioned word. Maybe it is an old-fashioned word, but the other word I put in there was courtesy. So when I've talked to international investors, they always cite Macron. They always cite Ireland. They often cite parts of the US administration. They often cite Singapore too. And what's that?
Did Liz Truss.
Well, and what's that about? That's about a professionalism in the relationship between government and business, replying to stuff. I mean, to carry on the Macron idea, what do businesses say to me? They get a pretty immediate yes or no from the Elysee. Now, business people like yes or no. What business people and investors really can't stand, and then actually go and invest their money and their time somewhere else, is when there's absolutely no response. And I call that in my report the black hole of business relations, and I'm afraid lately that's been one of the problems.
As a business leader, perhaps not so much with your report hat on, when you're looking now and you're looking at sort of the policy platform that is being sketched out by the Labour Party, where do you want to see some more clarity? Because I think a lot of the criticism, as we've seen in the last week as Labour sort of put it out its pitch to business, was there's still a lack of meat on the bone there. Where do you, as a business leader, as the author of the report as well, where do you want to see those gaps filled?
So one of the areas that, and I did this independently of Labour, although I'm pleased to say so far they're nodding to many of the things I'm saying, but and hopefully this is quite important for your viewers and readers. I put in a chapter about regulatory dialogue. And that's something I know a lot of investors absolutely care about, always have cared about, but maybe very, very intensively over the past four or 5 years. And what does that say? It says that, and it was a surprise to me before I started writing my report, which was that a prime minister, a chancellor and a business secretary hardly ever, and in fact I spoke to one former permanent secretary on this, he said to me, actually in his case, never sit down and discuss the landscape for doing business in our country. And what do I mean by that? That is about, whether or not this is an attractive place in terms of regulation, tax and skills. Why? Because there's institutional inertia. There's a sense that you get in the room with the regulator and you might talk about a specific piece of M&A, or you might talk about a specific rule out of the rule book. And, I did talk to some of the regulators along the way when I was producing my thinking, and they would be very keen to sit down and talk to a government about the landscape for doing regulation. So I was delighted, a bit surprised that in the end, in the inevitable negotiation between me doing this independently and where Labour are right now, that this chapter made it through. But I think for lots of people, Labour has cleared up, we heard it at the business conference last week, what their approach to business taxation will look like for the first term of a Labour government, a commitment to not chopping and changing the headline rate of corporation tax. But on regulation, I think that is an area that businesses do want to hear more about, because again, the dialogue between government and the regulators, I think, has been a bit dislocated lately.
But Ian, thank you very much for joining us on Bonds Ballots.
Thank you.
Some interesting points there from Ian Anderson on what that relationship could look like between the business community and a potential Labour government. Now, his report was just one of a number of announcements and goings-on last week in the Labour Party. Our political reporter, Jess Frank-Keys, was there on the ground at Labour's big business conference, was following all the details of Labour's big charm offensive. She's going to take us through what the party had to say. Jess, we've just heard from Ian Anderson there, who laid out this new partnership document for Labour and the business community in general last week. And it felt like there was this real charm offensive that kicked off from Labour towards the city, towards business. You were covering it all last week. Can you just take us through, I suppose, the various different parts of that charm offensive and what that looked like?
Yeah, so last week really felt like Labour's big business week, which they've been building up to for a while. This has been a real focus for them. There's several things to mention. You said Ian Anderson's review of how Labour engages with small businesses. And one thing they've previously highlighted as well is how they want to open government procurement to SMEs, so just as a way to get them more involved in that process. You've also had Tulip Siddiq, Labour's shadow city minister, reviewing Labour's relationship with the city and laying out some of the policies it would look to take there. Another big endorsement came from Richard Walker, chairman of Iceland. This is playing to a slightly different audience, maybe trying to appeal to the average Iceland shopper who might not be somebody who's quite as familiar with the intricacies of the square mile, but another kind of important target demographic for the party.
And quite big Tory converts there as well, with both Ian Anderson and Richard Walker as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, notably, Ian Anderson, obviously Boris Johnson's former business advisor, and a real big get for the party to have advising them on this really important relationship. And Richard Walker, obviously, as we know, had stood and attempted to stand several times, I think, if I'm right in saying, to become a Conservative MP. He was eager to do that, and he really laid out that he felt that actually he hadn't necessarily shifted to Labour, that Labour had actually moved much more towards that centre ground. So I think that's something that the party would definitely encourage. They would be happy, I would imagine, that that's how they're being seen.
Tory MPs were, as expected, quite strongly out in force, saying it was, a copy of their own plans. Are we actually seeing some more sort of concrete policy measures coming out now? Is there more of a plan actually being revealed by Reeves, Siddiq and Starmer?
I think it's yes and no. I think we will have to wait a little while longer for some of those really detailed, the real nuanced manifesto commitments. Labour are still in the process of early stages even of writing that manifesto. They've just taken submissions from the shadow cabinet and they'll have to go through several layers of vetting to kind of get them to the point where they put them out there to the public. So not quite yet on that. But I think what you are starting to see is Labour have got their 5 missions for the country. What you are starting to see is a bit more of the broad brushstrokes of what that might be. So one thing that Rachel Reeves announced, which was their big headline announcement, if you like, from Business Day, was that Labour would cap corporation tax at 25% if elected for the length of the next Parliament. And, you know, as we talked about earlier, it's giving that consistency and that predictability to businesses. That's really what they want to start being associated with more and more.
So lots more to come, lots more to be announced from the Labour Party in the coming months, I'm sure. But that charm offensive on business has very much kicked off now after last week's announcements. We're going to see a lot more meat on the bone in the coming months. We're going to see the city turn into very much the battleground between both parties. On Bonds Ballots, we're going to be unpicking that battleground. So let us know what you think of Labour's charm offensive in the comments below, and click subscribe here to stay up to date with the latest videos.